Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Ever stop to think about what keeps your online banking safe?
Mm.
Or, how that streaming service you love protects your data and stays reliable?
Uh-huh.
Well, today we're peeling back the curtain on something absolutely key to all that. SOC engagements. Sounds a bit technical, I know. But stick with us. The insights are pretty revealing about the digital world you use every single day.
Exactly. And honestly, understanding this stuff is a bit of a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. We're going to demystify the really meticulous steps auditors take, show you the incredible detail that builds confidence in the systems we all rely on.
So our mission today,
Our goal for you in this deep dive is simple. Clearly understand the practical phases of a SOC engagement. We'll break down each step, really get into the details so you get a solid grasp of this complex but really vital area.
okay, let's unpack this then. We've talked before about the initial planning and risk assessment for a SOC engagement.
Yeah.
That's sort of the groundwork, right? Where the auditor gets to know the company and spots potential problems.
That's right, the crucial first steps.
But once that groundwork is laid, once the auditors accepted the job and, done their homework, what actually happens next? What are they doing day to day to gather all that evidence?
Okay. This is where the real work of assurance really kicks off. Once that foundation, the risk assessment, is solid, the service auditor moves into a very structured phase. It's not just like randomly collecting documents.
Right.
It's a deliberate process. They need to gain a deep understanding of the service organization's system, rigorously test their internal controls, meticulously gather enough solid evidence, and even keep an eye out for any last-minute curveballs that might affect the final report. It's really about leaving no stone unturned.
So it's methodical then,
Yeah.
step by step, not just one big audit blob. Can you walk us through those main stages?
Absolutely. Think of it like a logical sequence, almost like building something complex brick by brick. There are basically 6 key areas of engagement performance after that initial planning and risk stuff is done. First, the auditor has to respond to the assessed risks. This means they tailor their whole audit approach based on the specific potential issues they flagged for that particular organization. You can't just use a generic checklist, The procedures have to directly address the unique risks.
Like a doctor tailoring treatment to a specific patient?
Exactly that, not just giving everyone the same pill. Second, they evaluate management's description of the service organization system. So the company provides this detailed story, right? Their narrative of how their system works, the processes, the controls. The auditor's job is to check if that story is accurate and fairly presented. Are they telling the truth?
Okay, so really checking their homework, not just accepting it.
Precisely. Third, and this is for both Type 1 and Type 2 engagements, they obtain and evaluate evidence about the suitability of the design of controls. This is about confirming if the controls, on paper at least, look like they could actually work. Could they achieve their objectives? Like looking at blueprints, does the design seem sound?
And then checking if those blueprints actually work in practice. That's got to be next, right?
That leads right into number 4. Obtaining and evaluating evidence about the operating effectiveness of controls. Now, this step is only for Type 2 engagements.
Ah, okay. The big difference.
Yeah. For a Type 2 report, the auditor doesn't just look at the design. They actively check if the controls are working as intended consistently over a specific period, like months. It's a huge difference from Type 1, which is just a snapshot in time. A Type 2 is more like watching the whole movie.
Gotcha. Type 2 is the performance review over time, proving it works consistently.
Yes. Fifth, after all that testing and digging, they evaluate the results. This means sifting through all the evidence stuff that confirms management's story, stuff that contradicts it, to really figure out what it all means for the system's integrity and for the people relying on that service. And finally, based on all that evidence and careful evaluation, they form the opinion. This is it. The auditor's final, unbiased judgment on whether the description is fair and, for Type 2, if the controls were designed right and worked effectively.
That's a really clear breakdown.
Yeah.
Thanks. But stepping back a bit for someone not, knee-deep in audit reports,
Yeah.
maybe a business using a partner, or just us regular folks using an app,
Yeah.
why does this super methodical approach matter so much? What's the real point?
Oh, it's absolutely fundamental. It's about building and maintaining trust in this, increasingly digital world we live in. Every single one of those steps is crucial to make sure the auditor's final opinion is sound, unbiased, reliable. Without it, the opinion would just be, well, an educated guess, right? Not real assurance.
Right.
This whole process gives user entities your bank, your favorite online shop, that app you just downloaded, and their auditors, their partners. It gives them tangible confidence in the service provider's processes, confidence in the security, the reliability. Think of it like a really meticulous chef. They follow a detailed recipe, step by step. Every ingredient, every temperature, every timing detail is checked. Why? To make sure the final dish isn't just tasty, but it's perfect and safe to eat right, free from issues. The audit process provides that same level of assurance, but for digital services.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting for me. Once an auditor flags those risks in the beginning, maybe a system vulnerability or, potential for human error, how do they actually respond? It can't just be a gut feeling, right? There must be a plan.
Absolutely, far more than a gut feeling. The auditor's main goal here is to get enough solid evidence to knock down what we call attestation risk to an acceptably low level.
Attestation risk.
Yeah.
What was that exactly?
It's basically the risk that the auditor messes up, that
Yeah.
they give the wrong opinion on the system, say everything's fine when it isn't, or vice versa. So if the risk of a material misstatement, a significant error is high, they need more evidence, stronger evidence, to be confident they're getting it right.
So more risk equals more digging. Higher stakes mean deeper investigation.
Exactly. When doing a SOC engagement, the auditor has to design and implement what we call overall responses to tackle those assessed risks. And then they design and perform further procedures, extra audit steps, and the nature, extent, and timing of those steps are specifically based on and responsive to the risks they found. It's not a generic playbook. It's a custom-tailored investigation for that specific situation.
What kinds of things make an auditor more concerned? What factors really crank up that risk assessment dial?
Several key things. First, materiality. How big would an error or a control failure need to be to actually sway the decisions of people reading the report? A tiny glitch might not matter, but a flaw affecting thousands. That's material.
Makes sense.
Second, the auditors read on the effectiveness of the control environment within the company. This is about the overall tone at the top, the ethical values, the general strength of control culture set by management. A weak environment often signals higher risk because it suggests maybe controls aren't taken that seriously.
Okay, the overall vibe matters.
It really does. And third, other components of internal control related to the specific service. How do different parts of the control system interact? How do they collectively affect, say, the security or availability of the service being audited?
So if that control environment seems weak, it sort of sends ripples through the whole audit, signals a need for much closer scrutiny.
Precisely. If parts of the control environment or other bits of the internal control system seem ineffective, the auditor will almost certainly ramp things up. They'll increase the nature, extent, and timing of their procedures. They'll design tougher, more targeted tests that are directly responsive to those higher risks they've identified.
Can you give us a concrete example, something that would make an auditor think, okay, hold on, this needs a closer look because there's a real risk here?
Sure. Let's take example 1. Audit procedures based on risk assessment. Imagine this. The auditor sees a business process where employees get big bonuses for hitting certain targets. Say, a customer service team gets rewarded purely based on the number of support tickets they close each day.
Okay, seems like a straightforward incentive to be productive.
On the surface, yes. But here's the risk an auditor sees immediately. What if there's a high risk that employees might, game the system, manipulate controls, or misreport outcomes to hit those targets and get the bonus? For instance, if the goal is closing tickets fast, maybe they close them without really fixing the customer's problem. Or maybe they even create fake tickets just to boost their numbers. This introduces that human element, that potential bias, which could totally undermine data integrity or the quality of service.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about system glitches, but about how human behavior, driven by incentives, might actually bypass or weaken the controls designed to prevent problems. So how does the auditor react to that kind of risk?
Well, in that scenario, it's highly likely the auditor will significantly step up their game. They'll probably increase the testing of those specific controls around ticket resolution, or maybe expand the sample size, look at way more tickets, or both. They might scrutinize a much larger batch of closed tickets, maybe try to trace them back to actual customer satisfaction scores, or look for patterns like lots of reopened issues. That could signal manipulation. It's about sharpening their detective tools to make sure those incentives aren't compromising things.
Beyond just doing more testing, what other tools are in the auditor's toolkit for responding to these higher risks? What are the strategies?
There are several really important overall responses. First, maintaining professional skepticism across the whole team. That means always having a questioning mind, critically looking at all the evidence, and being alert for anything that contradicts other information. Constantly asking, is this really right, or is there more to it?
A healthy dose of doubt.
Essential.
Right.
Second, assigning more experienced staff or bringing in specialists. If an area is super complex or risky, like advanced cybersecurity, maybe you put your seasoned pros on it or you call in experts.
Got it. Bring in the A-team for the tricky parts.
Exactly. Third, providing additional supervision. More oversight ensures thoroughness, quality control, especially in risky areas, catches potential slips early. Fourth, incorporating unpredictability. This is key. If the company knows exactly when and how you'll test, they might just, put on a good show for you.
The element of surprise.
Right. Mix it up. Test controls at unexpected times, select unusual samples. It prevents predictable patterns and gives you a more genuine picture, like a pop quiz versus a scheduled test.
Nice analogy.
And finally, making changes to the nature, extent, or timing of procedures. This is about tweaking the how much, and when of the audit work itself.
Could you give quick examples of each of those: nature, extent, time?
Sure. Changing the nature might mean going from just asking about a control to actually reperforming it yourself, like rerunning a calculation to see if you get the same result. Changing the extent could mean bumping up a sample size significantly, maybe from checking 25 transactions to checking 100. And changing the timing might involve testing controls throughout the year, say quarterly, instead of just at year end to get a more continuous view.
Okay, that makes sense.
This whole proactive, risk-based approach ensures the audit effort is focused where it's needed most. It leads to a more efficient audit, yes, but more importantly, a more reliable and trustworthy outcome. It's about smart resource allocation for maximum assurance.
So after the risk assessment, the company gives the auditor its system description, its story of how things operate. But how does the auditor actually know if that story is true and, tells the whole picture? Is it like checking if a company's slick marketing brochure actually matches the product?
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. This step is critical because that description, it's the foundation for the whole engagement. The auditor has to evaluate if management's description is fairly presented according to established rules or criteria. And we see slightly different focuses here for SOC1 versus SOC2 reports because they have different goals.
Right. SOC1 is more financial controls. SOC2 is security, availability, etc. Let's start with SOC1. For a report focused on financial impact, what makes that description fairly presented?
Okay, for SOC1, the auditor checks if the description is fairly presented in all material respects based on criteria management claims to meet. It's about confirming several key things. First, are the control objectives they state reasonable? Do their goals make sense for what they're doing?
Logical goals. Okay.
Second, were the controls they identified actually implemented? It's not enough to say you have a control. Is it actually in place and running?
Theory versus practice.
Exactly. Third, if the company relies on its clients to do certain controls, we call those complementary user entity controls, or CUECs, or if they use other vendors, subservice organizations, and rely on their controls, CSOCs are those dependencies clearly described. The user needs to know what they need to do, or what others are doing.
Right, the whole picture.
And fourth, if subservice organizations are involved, that needs to be described properly, including whether they use the carve-out or inclusive method. That tells the reader how those third-party controls are handled in this report. Transparency is key.
Wow, that's quite a checklist. So basically for SOC1, the auditor is making sure the company's internal rulebook for financial stuff is clear, logical, and matches what they actually do, especially with money and business partners. Grounding claims in reality.
You've got it. That rulebook or description needs to cover how the system was designed and really put into operation. It includes things like the types of services and financial transactions they handle, payroll, payments, storing financial data, the specific procedures, both automated and manual, for delivering these services, the step-by-step, the info used in those procedures records, data needed to start, approve, record, report transactions, how they handle significant non-transactional events, system updates, security fixes, error handling, the process for preparing reports for their clients, how do clients get the financial data they need, any services done by subservice organizations making that clear, the specific control objectives and the controls designed to meet them, the heart of SOC1, and other relevant bits about their overall control environment, risk assessment, information flow control activities, and how they monitor it all.
And you mentioned type 2 earlier.
Right. For a Type 2 SOC1, the description also has to include relevant details of any system changes during the report period. That's vital for understanding how things evolved. And a critical point, the description must not omit or provide misleading information. It won't list every tiny detail, but it has to be accurate and complete enough so users aren't misled.
That is a ton of detail.
Yeah.
How does the auditor actually gather the proof for all this? What are the hands-on steps they take?
Well, they rigorously assess the level of detail, think about who's going to use this report, and review all the documentation they can get, policy manuals, contracts, process narratives. Through asking questions and other checks, they actively confirm if the described system is actually up and running. Typical procedures.
Yeah.
They'll consider the user entities and how the service affects them that helps frame relevance. Read contracts with clients to see the promised obligations. Observe procedures being done by staff watching is key. Review manuals, flowcharts, other docs, do written policies match reality. And importantly, perform walkthroughs. Literally follow a transaction from start to finish through the system to see controls in action.
When would a description get flagged as not fairly presented? What are the big red flags?
Big red flags are things like stating controls are performed when they just aren't. Or maybe omitting relevant controls that aren't designed well or aren't working effectively, even if it wasn't intentional. These are serious misrepresentations.
Okay, now let's switch gears to SOC 2.1, security, availability, and all that. How does evaluating the description differ here? Is it still about being fairly presented?
For SOC2, the auditor also reads the description, but the focus shifts slightly. It's about whether the description presents the system that was designed and implemented in accordance with the specific SOC2 description criteria. It involves comparing the auditor's understanding of the service against the system described based on the specific trust services categories in scope, security, availability, etc.
So it's about whether the description accurately reflects the implemented system relating to those trust principles, like security.
Precisely. A SOC2 description is considered in accordance if it describes the system the company has actually implemented. Not planned, not wished for, but what's really operating. Includes relevant info for each applicable description criterion, covers all the bases for, say, security, and crucially, doesn't omit or distort information likely relevant to users' decisions. Again, no misleading stuff, a clear, honest picture.
What are the specific red flags for a SOC2 description then?
Well, saying IT components exist when they don't, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Or claiming processes and controls are implemented when they're actually not happening in practice. Another is including statements you just can't objectively evaluate, too vague, too subjective, like saying, we aim for maximum security without detailing the actual controls. That doesn't cut it.
Okay.
And really critically, they have to evaluate if each stated control has truly been implemented, meaning placed into operation.
Right.
If the auditor finds controls listed in the description that just aren't implemented, they're on paper, only they might ask management to remove them. If management refuses, that heavily impacts the auditor's conclusion and likely means a modified opinion, pointing out the discrepancy.
That's a clear line. So how does an auditor get the evidence for SOC2? What procedures do they use beyond just reading?
They use a pretty broad range of procedures for SOC2, often digging into various operational aspects. This could include discussing the assertion and description with management and staff interviewing them, reading the company's annual report for business context, reading service commitments and system requirements, are they appropriate? Inspecting risk assessment documents, including mitigation plans, how do they handle threats, observing controls being performed in real time, reading client contracts, partner agreements, even marketing materials, what are they promising publicly, reading risk governance documents, board minutes, org charts, reading docs on communicating security roles, employee handbooks, codes of conduct, reading internal audit reports, third-party assessments, committee presentations, what other reviews found, reading vendor contracts, understanding third-party dependencies, and reading incident response and recovery plans, how do they handle problems.
You mentioned walkthroughs for SOC1. Are they just as vital for SOC2? And what do they look like when you're examining things like system security or availability?
Oh yeah, walkthroughs are absolutely crucial for SOC2 too, mainly because they give you concrete proof that controls are truly implemented. For SOC2, a walkthrough involves following a transaction, event, or activity like a user login, a data backup, or a security alert from start to finish out of the system, using the same docs and tools staff use. It combines inquiry, asking staff questions, observation, watching them do it, and inspecting documents, maybe using flowcharts or questionnaires to help understand the control design. The auditor will also explicitly ask about times when controls didn't work as described, asking about the exceptions, the failures, and they'll question variations for different types of events. Does the process hold up for complex scenarios, not just simple ones?
Okay.
A well-done walkthrough isn't just about understanding the flow. It often gives you evidence about design suitability and operating effectiveness at the same time. So yeah, they're very efficient and powerful for getting that real-world view.
That sounds incredibly thorough. Definitely not just taking management's word. They're really digging to make sure the story matches reality, right down to how data moves. What if, after all that, the description is found to be misleading or incomplete?
Well, the auditor has to evaluate if it's misleading in the context of the whole engagement based on all the evidence. They also consider if extra disclosures are needed, maybe about how criteria were interpreted or important subsequent events we'll touch on. If they believe it's misstated or misleading, they have to ask management to fix it. If management refuses, that forces the auditor to consider the impact on their opinion, usually meaning a modified opinion in the report, clearly stating where the description falls short.
Okay, so description verified. Now for the real hands-on inspection, how do auditors test if these controls are actually working? Having a good plan is one thing, executing it perfectly is another.
Exactly right. This is the absolute core of a Type 2 SOC engagement. It's not enough to understand the system and check the description. The auditor needs concrete proof that controls were both suitably designed and operated effectively throughout the whole period covered, moving from theory to proven practice, from blueprint to working engine.
Let's break that down. First, suitability of design. How do they check that, beyond just reading the description?
For design suitability, yeah, the evidence from understanding the system and evaluating the description is a good start. Does the plan seem logical? Could it actually work? To supplement that, they might do more. Ask personnel more detailed questions about the control design, how it handles specific events, inspect documents related to design like architecture diagrams or security policies, do additional walkthroughs, maybe focusing specifically on design aspects, asking what-if scenarios, read supporting system documentation like manuals or configuration guides, and critically determine if known attacks, vulnerabilities, or threats have been adequately addressed by the design. Is it robust enough? When evaluating design, they also consider things like the frequency of the control is daily enough. The competence and authority of the person doing it, are they qualified? The precision of the task, is it specific enough? And any contradictory evidence suggesting it's not designed as claimed.
Got it. So design looks good on paper. Now, proving it works, that's operating effectiveness, right? The performance review.
Exactly. For Type 2, if controls are suitably designed, they should help meet the trust criteria and provide reasonable assurance that service commitments were achieved. Operating effectiveness testing is about confirming these well-designed controls actually do their job consistently over the whole period, verifying they operate as designed by people with the right authority and competence.
Okay.
The evidence here focuses on how controls were applied, the consistency of application, and by whom or by what means they were applied. And quick note on subservice orgs. If the inclusive method is used, the auditor tests controls there too.
So how does the auditor decide how to test, how much to test, and when? These seem like really critical decisions affecting the audit's depth.
Oh, they're absolutely core to the audit strategy. The auditor figures out the nature, extent, and timing of tests needed to get sufficient, appropriate evidence on operating effectiveness. Think how much, and when.
All right, let's start with nature, how they test.
Okay, the nature of testing for operating effectiveness is different from testing design. When designing and performing these tests, the auditor will often use inquiry, hands-on methods like inspection, looking at logs, reports, observation, watching controls happen, or reperformance, redoing a transaction or trying to bypass a control themselves. Figure out if the controls being tested depend on other controls. If control A relies on control B working first, they need to check control B too. It's about that chain of trust. And finally, choose an effective way to select items for testing, making sure the sample is representative. And crucially, they have to trust the evidence they get. Is the data complete, accurate, precise enough? Good data leads to good conclusions.
And extend how much testing?
Right.
Is it always like 25 items or does it change?
No fixed number. The extent, sample size, number of observations is purely based on the auditor's professional judgment. They weigh several factors. The tolerable rate of deviation, how many failures are acceptable before the control is deemed ineffective, their error threshold, the expected rate of deviation, how many errors do they think they'll find based on past experience or benchmarks. The frequency of the controlled daily controls need bigger samples than monthly ones usually. The relevance and reliability of the evidence they can get, the length of the testing period, the significance of the controls over sensitive data get more scrutiny, and evidence from tests of other related controls. If multiple controls cover the same risk, maybe less testing per control is needed.
Okay, that makes sense. And lastly, timing. When do they test? End of the year. All through.
Timing is also key. Factors here include when information is available. Electronic files might get overwritten, right? So testing needs to happen before data disappears. Some things only happen at certain times or can only be checked after the period ends, like complex reconciliations. Whether the control leaves evidence. If it's just a visual check with no log, observation in real time might be the only way. And again, the significance of the control. More critical controls might get tested more often or at specific times throughout the period.
So they could test mid-year.
Absolutely. They might test at interim dates, say halfway through, or at period end, or even after the period if the evidence only shows up later. If they test mid-year, though, they need procedures to cover the rest of the period too to make sure nothing changed significantly.
This level of detail really drives home how thorough these audits are. It's far beyond just ticking boxes. It's digging into the real operational nuts and bolts. What about how companies handle problems, failures, incidents? Do auditors look at that during testing?
Yes, definitely. Understanding how the service organization handles system failures, security incidents, even just customer complaints, that's vital for assessing overall control. Management should identify how they handle incidents in their description, which gives the auditor a starting point.
Okay.
Auditors will inquire about the controls for this and might look at things like board meeting minutes. Are incident responses discussed? Is bad news reaching the top? Are there plans? This shows the tone. Whistleblower hotlines. Do they exist? Are complaints monitored? Are violators disciplined? They might even test the hotline. Policies for users. Are users told how to report issues? Is info available on portals or websites? Are changes and alerts communicated? Management monitoring and training. Is management watching performance? Are staff trained properly on controls? System descriptions for users. Do clients get clear info about the system, boundaries, processes, transparency matters? Vendor-partner agreements. Are responsibilities clear, especially for incidents? Plan system changes. Are updates reviewed, approved, scheduled, and communicated properly, like checking IT maintenance schedules?
Okay, so after all that intense testing, document review, observation, information gathering, how does the auditor actually make sense of it all? Is it like a detective piecing together clues, or more like a scientist analyzing data?
It's really a mix of both. Every single piece of information matters, whether it supports what management said or contradicts it. And interestingly, even the absence of information like a missing log file is considered evidence. It might point to poor documentation or a control that leaves no trace.
What if they just don't feel like they have enough information to be sure?
That's the sufficiency test. The auditor absolutely must have sufficient and appropriate evidence to back up their opinion. Sufficient means enough, appropriate means relevant and reliable. If after everything they feel the evidence isn't sufficient or appropriate based on their judgment, they have to do more procedures, try to get more evidence.
And if they still can't get it?
If they still can't obtain what they need, maybe the company limits their access, or the records just don't exist that has serious implications. It could lead to a modified report, highlighting the limitation, or in really severe cases, they might even have to withdraw from the engagement altogether. When evaluating, auditors do both quantitative analysis looking at the numbers, error rates, sample results, and qualitative analysis, understanding the nature and cause of any issues found. It's not just counting errors, it's figuring out why they happened, the root cause, and the real impact. They also specifically look at any control deviations that might make the description misleading or mean controls aren't designed or working effectively.
So, if they find problems, a misleading description, a control failure, how deep do they investigate? What are they trying to figure out?
Good question. For any identified misstatement or deficiency, they dig into the nature and cause to determine several things. Does the misstatement mean the description fails the criteria, or could it mislead users if the opinion isn't changed? Are control deviations within acceptable limits, or are they genuine deficiencies, real breakdowns? If deviations are okay, do the tests still support the control being effective overall? Are the deficiencies pervasive, affecting many areas, indicating a systemic issue, or are they isolated incidents? Is more testing needed, either of that control or related ones? What if they can't do more testing on certain items? Is that a deviation or a scope limitation? What's the magnitude of the effect? How big a deal is this deficiency for achieving service commitments? Could users be misled if the opinion isn't modified to reflect the problems? And finally, any known or suspected fraud or non-compliance they uncovered needs careful consideration.
This is definitely where the rubber meets the road. Sounds like a rigorous process to make sure the final report tells the true story, warts and all. So if they find something significant, something material, what happens to the auditor's opinion?
If they find material description misstatements or material issues with control design, or for type 2, material problems with operating effectiveness, the auditor must modify their opinion. Their understanding of why these issues happened helps them decide exactly how to modify it to properly inform users. It might be an except for opinion clean, except for specific issues, or if problems are really widespread and serious, maybe even an adverse opinion saying things are fundamentally flawed. The goal is always a clear, honest assessment.
Okay, an audit report covers a specific time, like last year, and gets
Yeah.
issued, say, now. But what about stuff that happens after the audit period ended, but before the report is actually released, or even after the report is already out there?
That's a really important point about timing and responsibility. We make a distinction here. Subsequent events are things happening between the end of the audit period and the report issue date. Subsequently discovered facts are things learned after the report is already issued. Both can seriously affect the report's relevance.
Let's tackle subsequent events. First, stuff happening after year-end but before the report is signed off. How do auditors deal with those? Just ignore them since the period is over.
Absolutely not. These events could significantly affect the description, control design, operating effectiveness for Type 2, or even management's own assertion. Disclosing these might be essential to stop users from being misled. The auditor actually has to ask management if they know of any such events. If they do, the auditor needs to perform procedures to get evidence about them, maybe inspect internal audit reports, regulatory communications, or other reports issued during that gap period.
Can you give some concrete examples of subsequent events that would likely matter for a SOC report? Things an auditor would definitely need to know and maybe disclose because they changed the picture?
Yeah, these examples really show the real-world crunch and why auditors need to be aware even of things happening late in the game or just after the period ends. Imagine, late in the audit period, the IT director gave all programmers full access to production data, letting them modify customer info. Even if discovered after the period, this is a huge control breakdown during the period, impacts security, integrity, or for SOC2, a major confidentiality breach happened during the report period, exposing customer data. That's a direct failure of a trust principle, highly material. For SOC1, forged signatures were found on trade instructions processed during the period, bypassing authentication. Failure of key financial controls, also SOC1. A large employee theft defalcation occurred over several months within the audit period. Big breakdown in financial controls.
Wow. Those examples really bring it home. Not abstract issues, but real problems affecting real people and businesses. Are there subsequent events that probably wouldn't affect the SOC report? Important news, maybe, but not relevant to the audit scope.
Yes, definitely. Not everything that happens after the period end impacts the current SOC report, because it doesn't reflect on the controls operating during that specific period. For example, the service organization got acquired by a bigger company. Big business news, sure, but it doesn't change the controls that were in place during the audit period. It's a future structural change. A major operational disruption happened due to a hurricane, often an external event, a force majeure. It doesn't necessarily mean the controls failed. The event might have been beyond their scope, or the company made huge changes to its IT systems after the period ended, like a massive conversion or outsourcing. That's about the future system, not the one audited during the period.
Okay.
These are generally seen as external or future-looking, important for other contexts maybe, but unlikely to change the opinion on the controls during the period covered by this specific report.
What if management knows about a significant subsequent event, one that should be disclosed, but they refuse to put it in the description or assertion?
That's a very serious situation. If the auditor learns of a significant subsequent event, they should first ask management to disclose it. If management refuses, and leaving it out would clearly mislead users, the auditor has to consider strong actions. Either modify their own report to disclose the event, ensuring transparency, or, in really difficult cases, maybe even withdraw from the engagement entirely. Report integrity comes first.
And what about facts discovered after the report is already issued? It's out there, clients are using it, and suddenly critical new info surfaces about the period covered.
Right. So the auditor isn't required to go looking for new problems after the report date, but they are professionally responsible for responding appropriately if facts come to light after the report date that relate to the period covered. It's an ongoing responsibility, even after the main job is done.
Okay.
The auditor uses their judgment. If they'd known this fact at the report date, would it have changed the report? Did the fact exist back then? Are people still relying on this report? That determines the urgency.
It's like the ongoing duty of a watchman, right?
Yeah.
Even after the shift, if something critical emerges that makes the previous all clear wrong, what steps would they take?
They'd typically start by talking with management, understanding the new facts. They might do more procedures to see if the report needs revision or if it's still okay. Depending on how much time has passed and if a new report is coming soon, they might need to notify people currently using the old report. It's crucial users aren't relying on potentially outdated or misleading info for big decisions.
So, after all this digging, investigating, even considering things after the period ends, is there a final formal sign-off from management? What's the very last piece that locks everything down and ensures management formally accepts responsibility?
Yes, and it's incredibly important. Written representations from management. People sometimes think it's just a formality, but it's absolutely not. It's a critical piece of audit evidence in itself. It does a few things. Confirms statements management made during the audit, documents that those statements are still appropriate, and really helps avoid misunderstandings between the auditor and management about responsibilities or the report's scope. It's basically management putting their signature on the line for the assertions made.
Who actually provides these representations, and when does this happen in the process?
They come from the right people in management or governance, those with responsibility and knowledge, usually senior execs. If a subservice org is included using the inclusive method, you get reps from their management too. The letter is typically dated the same day the auditor signs their report, and it covers everything in the report, the subject matter, the period. And critically, the auditor normally can't even issue their report until they get this letter. It's the final formal prerequisite.
What exactly does management have to sign off on in this letter? What's the key content that makes it so important?
It's a pretty comprehensive list of confirmations and disclosures. Management essentially signs off on things like their formal assertion about the system based on the criteria, their definitive statement, that all relevant matters are reflected and anything contradicting the assertion or any communications from regulators have been fully disclosed. No holding back. Acknowledging the responsibility for the system, the assertion, selecting the right criteria, and making sure those criteria are appropriate. Accountability rests with them, that any known subsequent events with a material effect have been disclosed, that they've given the auditor all relevant access and information, nothing hidden, that they believe any uncorrected errors in description or controls are immaterial individually and combined, that they've disclosed. All known internal control deficiencies relevant to the audit, that they've disclosed. Any known actual, suspected, or alleged fraud or noncompliance affecting the subject matter, that they've disclosed. Other relevant matters the auditor asked about, that they've disclosed. Specifically for SOC2, relevant noncompliance or misstatements. For SOC1, those affecting user entities, that they've disclosed. Knowledge of fraud by management or employees affecting the report's fairness, SOC1, or system description commitments, SOC2, that they've disclosed. And for SOC2, significant system incidents impairing service achievement, that they've disclosed. And for SOC1, that significant assumptions and material estimates are reasonable.
That is an incredibly thorough list. Really puts the responsibility squarely on management for transparency and accuracy. What happens if management refuses to provide these representations, or if the auditor doubts their reliability?
Okay, yeah. If management won't provide them, or if the auditor seriously doubts the integrity or competence of the people signing, or feels the reps just aren't reliable, that leads to serious consequences.
Oh.
The auditor first needs to discuss it with management, find out why, then they have to reevaluate the integrity of those people and consider how that impacts the reliability of all the other evidence gathered. If you can't trust their final word here, can you trust anything else?
Right, that's a major red flag.
It absolutely is. If the issue isn't resolved satisfactorily, the auditor has to take action. Failure to provide these reps is typically a scope limitation. The auditor's ability to finish the job properly is blocked. In that case, they might be precluded from issuing an unmodified opinion, meaning they might have to issue a qualified opinion or even an adverse one highlighting the problem. Or, depending on the rules, they might even have to withdraw from the engagement entirely because they can't conscientiously issue a report. This document really solidifies management's accountability. It's that final acknowledgement that gives weight to the whole thing.
Wow. What a journey through the really intricate world of SOC engagements, from assessing risks, scrutinizing descriptions, all that rigorous testing, getting those final formal assurances. It's crystal clear there's an immense amount of work and, frankly, dedication behind these reports. Really puts into perspective what it takes to build trust online.
Indeed. This deep dive, I hope, has shown you the methodical, very detailed steps auditors take to provide that assurance about a service organization's controls. It really is about transparency and accountability. Ultimately, it builds trust in the digital services you rely on every single day, banking apps, cloud services, photo sharing, you name it. It helps ensure that what's promised, in terms of security and reliability, is actually delivered and controlled effectively.
So, pulling it all together, what does this mean for you listening? You're not an auditor, but you use these services constantly.
Well, consider this. In a world that leans so heavily on data and digital services, understanding these processes means you can look beyond just the surface claims. You now have a window into the meticulous evidence gathering, the risk assessment, the verification that underpins these reports. So how might adopting a bit of an auditor's mindset, questioning assumptions, seeking actual evidence, understanding the underlying processes, how might that help you evaluate information and make better decisions in your own life? Whether you're choosing a new online service, deciding if a news story is credible, or even making a personal financial choice, that ability to dig a little deeper, to ask for the proof. It can be incredibly empowering, don't you think?
That is a really powerful thought to chew on. Thinking like an auditor in everyday life. Interesting. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep digging for those insights.